was the Victorians who cherished the idea of home as a domestic haven. They coined the phrase safe as houses.
And in this age of invention, homes were bursting at the seams with new gadgets, products and conveniences. In the bedroom were the latest beauty products and manufactured clothes, while in the nursery the toys were brand new and factory produced. And for the first time, the stove warmed the entire house. The original home sweet home. But there was a problem.
Many of the exciting products and appealing innovations they welcomed into their homes were not just health hazards, they were killers.
And with the aid of science, I'll seek out these domestic assassins.
Oh, their houses were disgusting.
I'll be revealing what the Victorians couldn't see inside their homes.
These things undoubtedly would have killed many children.
And showing the terrible injuries that were inflicted in the name of progress.
What you need to do is move your bust up. Okay, just...
And I'll feel the strain of chasing the Victorian ideal.
Right, I feel a bit better now.
Welcome to the perilous world of the real Victorian home.
In the second half of the 19th century, cities exploded to house the booming middle classes. In just over 50 years, their number grew from 2.5 million to over 9. And these new urban middle classes took immense pride in their homes. They had money and they wanted to spend it on making their houses cosy havens of domesticity and comfort. Not for these people, the grim perils of Victorian factory life, or the gritty reality of the overcrowded streets. The sort of family who lived here enjoyed a level of comfort and luxury previously unknown to ordinary people. The cost of necessities fell dramatically, and new mass production techniques made goods available and affordable. This meant a level of conspicuous consumption never witnessed before. They filled their rooms with things that made the house a home. They'd been inspired by the Great Exhibition of 1851, which showcased the latest and the best in gadgets and consumer goods.
What had been happening now for the best part of 100 years suddenly crystallized in this extraordinary exhibition. It wasn't so much that it was new as it was just suddenly, boom, in bulk. As the century went on and consumerism began to increase, one of the fascinating things is that the phrase standard of living first appeared. For the first time in history, you measured how good your life was by how many objects you possessed. When you think about it, that's actually a very strange idea.
You couldn't just buy anything. What was and what wasn't tasteful was discussed at length in the many and various new household guides and magazines. John Ruskin, the leading art critic and social theorist, impressed on Victorian consumers the importance of making the right choices.
Good taste is essentially a moral quality. What we like determines what we are, and to teach taste is inevitably to form character.
Yet while the Victorians fretted about abstract notions of morality, they were oblivious to the real dangers that came from things they had welcomed into their houses. Every room in the Victorian home was filled with hidden killers.
And one of the most dangerous places was the drawing room.
The Victorians were really rejecting the idea of the 18th century classicism, the restraint, the delicacy, the white walls. That was all over. They wanted clutter, they wanted colour, they wanted excess. They really furnished to show that for them colour and clutter and objects, that was wealth and that was importance and that was riches.
one thing that particularly indicated both good taste and status was wallpaper. The richer the pattern and the darker, more vivid the colour, the better. Why? Because with the introduction of gas lighting for the first time in history, there was enough light in the house for ordinary people to have and enjoy intense colour on their walls.
As a result, there was something of a wallpaper craze. Manuals like Cassell's Household Guide, which told the Victorians how to do everything, outlined principles of good taste and told them which patterns of wallpaper to buy.
They were influencing a massive market. Wallpaper sales had shot up from around 1 million pieces a year in 1834 to 32 million by 1874.
Cassell's even gives what it calls its theory of colour. It describes its rules for the artistic appreciation in dress, in furniture, and it recommends green. It calls it a colour of repose. It says the eye experiences a healthy and peculiarly grateful impression from this colour, as opposed to something like yellowish red, which it says is the preference of impetuous, robust men and savage nations.
A particularly brilliant green, known as Scheele's green, was all the rage. Scheele was the Swedish scientist who first mixed the pigment to produce an intensely vivid colour that didn't fade. Its incredible popularity meant that it was used in everything from carpets, blancmange, candles and children's toys. But most of all, it was used in industrial quantities in wallpaper. There was one strange coincidence. As wallpaper sales escalated, so did reports of unexplained deaths and illnesses in the home. But there was nothing mysterious about it. The magic ingredient that was giving the wallpaper its rich green hue was arsenic.
These were samples of what would be considered as tasteful wallpapers to have in a Victorian home. This on the walls would have been loaded with arsenic. Actually, in the printing of the book, it's also used arsenical dyes.
So this book that you're showing me now has arsenic-infused pages?
There's quite a lot of arsenic in that.
It's not that I don't believe what you're saying, but could you prove it?
Yeah, it's very easy to do. If I use this instrument, which is a portable XRF, it tells us which contaminants, metallic contaminants, are present in the items. And basically, you can see straight off that this has got large amounts of copper in it, and it's got large amounts of arsenic in it.
Oh, yes.
The actual salts used in this pigment are copper arsenate.
In this book? Is it
This
safe
old
for you
book?
to touch?
Probably not. I'll wash my hands afterwards.
Modern science can prove the Victorian wallpaper contained arsenic, but this danger wasn't fully understood at the time. To confuse matters further, the symptoms of arsenic poisoning were very similar to cholera, which had been rampant in Britain in living memory.
The immediate effects would be of pain, swelling of the esophagus, very dry throat and difficulty in swallowing. And then what's described is agonising abdominal pains as the whole digestive tract is affected by the arsenic. Vomiting, diarrhoea, and sounds terribly unpleasant, and then people would die, which was said to be quite a relief because it's such an agonising way to die.
Newspaper headlines continued to report mysterious illnesses and deaths, and links were made with arsenic.
In the second half of the 19th century, the newspapers are full of cases like this one. 6-month-old child dies as a result of chewing on a piece of emerald green wallpaper.
But even if you hadn't eaten the wallpaper, you weren't safe.
In fact, the wallpaper was endangering the health of the nation in another hidden and much more insidious way.
Thanks to a chemical reaction, poisonous fumes are thought to have infiltrated the very air they were breathing.
There's a lot of debate about the production of arsenic gases from the wallpaper. The actual surface of the wallpaper, particularly flock wallpapers, could come off and your house would be covered in arsenical dust. But also in Victorian houses which weren't centrally heated, they were relatively damp. You put damped together with wallpaper paste and cellulose, which is in the wallpaper itself, and you get fungal growth. And as many fungi can actually volatilize those arsenical salts into a volatile form of arsenic, and they are highly toxic.
These things were billowing out arsenic in the home, in which obviously the windows were hardly ever open because of the smog. They sat there in this lovely fug of arsenic, thinking they were in this perfect, virtuous, healthy home.
It doesn't actually matter how the arsenic is absorbed into the body, whether you breathe it in, whether it comes in through the skin or the other membranes, or whether you actually eat it. It actually has a very similar effect because its effects are via the bloodstream. So the arsenic gets into the bloodstream and travels around the body. But one of the problems with the slower arsenic poisoning of a small amount over a longer time is that it could cause very vague symptoms. And obviously, if you're being poisoned by something in a particular room of the house, and when you left that room you got a bit better, it could come and go. And so it was much harder to differentiate it from other illnesses that were around at the time.
Some doctors began to question the use of arsenic in wallpaper as more and more mystery deaths were reported in the home.
The Lancet too took up the cause.
There appears good reason for believing that a very large amount of sickness and mortality among all classes is attributable to this cause, and that it may probably account for many of the mysterious diseases of the present day, which so continually baffle all medical skill.
In 1856, a couple in Birmingham reported to their doctor, Dr. Hines, that they were suffering from inflamed eyes, headaches, and sore throats. Even their pet parrot was drooping.
They decided to go on holiday to the seaside, and their symptoms disappeared. They suspected something in their house, and they had recently applied bright green wallpaper to 2 rooms at home. Dr. Hines wondered if that alone could be responsible for their ailments.
People went to the seaside and took the waters and took the spa. What effectively they were doing is moving out of a toxic environment into a healthy, diluted environment where you had fresh air, water that came from a known source, not relying on what was in a concentrated area within their property. They moved away from a toxic environment.
What's really astounding is how much arsenic there was in a Victorian drawing room when you add up all the materials that contained arsenic pigment.
Certainly we know that there was a huge amount of arsenic in, say, a Victorian living room which had 100 square metres surface area could contain up to 2.5 kilograms of arsenic, and that's a lot of arsenic.
That's a huge amount of arsenic, isn't it?
It's a huge amount of arsenic. This wall here to see this.
Dr. Hines, along with some other medical practitioners, became an outspoken critic of the use of arsenic pigment. In Germany, arsenical wallpapers had been banned, but not in the UK.
The wallpaper manufacturers didn't want people to think there was anything wrong with their products, and say the Lancet and the British Medical Journal fought a long campaign to bring this to the public fore, so there was quite a lot of dispute that was going on.
Some doctors and newspapers called on the British government to ban the poisonous paper. But others were quick to belittle the claims of the killer wallpaper. Some manufacturers even offered to eat it to prove how safe it was. One of Britain's most celebrated wallpaper designers was William Morris, a leading light of the arts and crafts movement. He was also one of the fiercest critics of the heartless industrialists of this period. But what is not well known about this champion of handicraft is that he was a director of the biggest arsenic-producing mine in the world, Devon Great Consols.
William Morris is making most of his money from arsenic.
That's quite a surprise, isn't it? Because of course we associate William Morris as being, you know, this leader of the arts and crafts movement, as someone who's, going back to basics, back to natural things. But he's got this mind that potentially is certainly selling arsenic, whether he's using it in his wallpapers or not.
The Times said there was enough arsenic produced from that mine to kill the entire planet and every creature on it.
Some of the people who came out with the processes had vested interests in other locations, that they would own arsenic mines, they would own areas where it was in their interest to include arsenic into paints, dyes, whatever.
Did William Morris ever accept that he was doing this, or did he continue to deny it?
Well, there's an interesting letter. There was a customer complaining that the wallpaper was poisoning him and his family. And basically, William Morris said it was witch fever. So that was the sole utterance we have.
That it was witch fever? In other words, he thought he was being accused of something that just wasn't true?
Well, he was just saying it was, these doctors were saying, arsenical wallpapers were killing people and damaging people's health. And he was just saying, it's mumbo-jumbo, basically what he was saying.
Contrary to Morris's claims, the evidence building up became impossible to deny. But it would take intervention from the very top before things started to change.
One of the key tipping points of that recognition was when Queen Victoria herself had wallpaper of Shield Green, and she had a diplomat who actually came to stay with her, who fell ill overnight. And she was, I think, the records show that she was quite put out, to be perfectly honest, that she'd been stood up early in the morning and he hadn't turned up, but actually the poor chap had actually killed overnight because he was actually effectively poisoned by the arsenic in the wallpaper. She was a little sceptical about it, but then when it actually came out in the papers, and there were actually quite a lot of publications around that time, was actually that she'd done that. It was then that step change in maybe we need to think in how we regulate this.
Unbelievably, the use of arsenic in wallpaper was never officially banned. But as consumers understood its danger, they stopped buying these wallpapers and forced commercial practice to change. Morris Wallpapers and other astute manufacturers started to advertise their product as arsenic-free. Certainly by 1872, even the Star Guides had switched to safer printing. But we'll never know how many died a slow death through the prevalence of arsenic in Victorian products.
I cannot see that having this amount of arsenic dust floating around a Victorian home wouldn't lead to chronic health problems. It's a class 1 carcinogen, it's a human carcinogen. So years of exposure to this would have led to cancers, basically.
The Victorian ideal, or perhaps fantasy of domesticity, was that the lady of the house should be, as Charles Dickens describes it in The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the ministering angel of domestic bliss. Victorian women were encouraged to make their home a reassuring sanctuary for their husbands, away from the jealousies, cares, and dangers of working life.
The idea of the angel of the house was obviously a literary creation, but it tapped in completely to what the Victorians essentially wanted. It was a movement away from the fact that in the 18th century, usually father and mother had pitched in together in the business. With the professionalisation, the growth of factories, the home was away from the place of work, so the home became this ideal place of perfection and taste, this bubble, enclosed bubble of purity.
As the home became an ideal, it needed to be protected and nurtured, and therefore buying things for the home, creating things for the home, came to be seen as the woman's occupation.
The men went out there conquering the empire, the women stayed at home and kept things pure.
Women were expected not only to create the perfect home, the lady of the house had to measure up as well. Our next danger in this house is in the bedroom. The pursuit of this feminine ideal wasn't entirely safe. Lurking in many beautifying products were harmful toxins.
Part of being the ideal Victorian woman was looking just right. Whatever your physique, one of these came in handy. In fact, this was essential.
Corsets kept everything under control, and they meant self-reserve, and that was vital to the Victorian woman, because the opposite was just excess and freedom and flesh flying everywhere, and once you did that, well, the world might fall down.
Feels quite tight already.
You're actually just squeezing all the air out of my mouth.
Sarah Nicol looks after one of the biggest corset collections in the country.
So Sarah, tell me about all the different layers we can see here. What's going on?
First of all, we've got the chemise underneath, so you would never have worn your corset next to your skin.
The corset predates the bra. Its function was to support the chest and help take the weight of up to 14 pounds of clothing.
But your cunning occasion, then over the top of this, you would have had a petticoat as well.
That's sort of 5 garments before
Yeah.
you've even got to your outerwear.
It is, yes. So this is part of the Symington.
The Symington factory manufactured corsets that were affordable for everybody.
They did all of their own artwork and printing for all their box tops for their corsets.
That's just beautiful.
It may look beautiful, but women were unwittingly paying a terrible price. In the 1860s and 70s, corsetry became increasingly extreme.
By the mid-19th century, the ideal female form, the corseted female form, was everywhere in newspapers, magazines, journals aimed at women. And this celebrity, the actresses had it, the dancers had it, but particularly these fashion plates had it, this impossible figure. I mean, they were drawn simply because no woman would look like that.
What kind of corsets and how restrictive they were depended on your age, your class, your occupation, and how fashionable you were.
It was recommended that a corset was to be worn at all times, and there was no escape, not even in the colonies.
Symington's made this to market directly at ladies that were going to tropical regions. So they were either going with their man or to get their man. It's called the ventilated corset. For obvious reasons, it has the centre section removed.
There were women wearing this in all parts of the British Empire,
Yeah,
whatever the weather.
Yes, and you were regarded as a loose woman if you didn't wear your corset.
It demonstrated their character, and it demonstrated that they were fine and upright citizens and, you know, fit for the British Empire.
These robust cages of whalebone and steel were turned into potential killers by one surprisingly small technological advance: the metal eyelet.
What difference does that make?
It allows people, if they want to tight lace their corset without the fabric pulling away.
The metal eyelet made it easier to get the look because it was possible to lace tightly without the material tearing, as it previously would have done.
There was a fashion for wearing very, very, very tight bodices. I mean, it's fascinating. You see in photographs the fabric pulls in a way that we would think means it doesn't fit.
A tight lacing is something that a minority of people did, and that is to get your waist as small as you possibly can. They used to do this by lacing their corset tighter and tighter.
Some women would keep their corsets on day and night to train their bodies.
So what are the effects of a corset on the body in the long term?
Well, if I could just show you here the position of the normal organs. So the liver, for example, our largest internal organ, sits underneath the ribs on the right. And so it's a large wedge-shaped organ that sits here under the ribs. And so in a corset, which brings the ribs in very tightly to give the typical small-waisted outline, the liver gets squashed upwards and it presses against the ribs. And in fact, there are specimens of livers taken from women who have died, who've worn tight corsets, actually have ridges on them where the ribs have made indentations in the surface of the liver because it's been so tight. And another organ that may be affected by a tight corset is the stomach. That sits here, underneath the rib cage, and so if the rib cage is pulled in by the corset, the stomach is pushed downwards into the abdominal cavity, and that would then have an effect on the rest of the abdominal organs, which would be pushed down.
This is a pregnancy corset from 1885.
Some women even wore corsets when pregnant.
a particular choice came for women about the corset is when they fell pregnant, because many husbands complained they didn't want their baby's head shaped and moulded, but there were women who continued to wear corsets through pregnancy, which, you know, there's no way at all that is possibly good for the baby.
One of the problems with corsets after pregnancy, particularly if women had a lot of babies, was that of prolapse of the uterus. The pelvic floor muscles having been weakened during childbirth, and then a very tight corset that increases the pressure in the abdomen, forcing all the organs down. So that would have been a very unwanted side effect of wearing tight corsets.
Now it's my turn.
I've got it a little bit tighter. I don't know whether you can feel that I've got it any tighter.
Yeah, I can feel it. Yeah. I confess I felt delighted to have a smaller waist.
Oh, result! Yes. I can see why they did it now. 24 inches, look.
24 3/4.
The Victorian household guides even advised on suitable exercises for a lady. I'm just exhausted after doing just that. I'm not really that unfit, honestly. Or am I? We're going to use sports science equipment with Matt Ferber to measure the effect of the corset on my body.
Yep, I'm happy. You happy?
Yep.
Yeah, as happy as you can be.
First, I have to give him a baseline of fitness without the corset. I exercise for 6 minutes. Now Matt monitors my vital signs with the corset on. First, how it affects me at rest.
And 3, 2, 1, go.
And I repeat the same exercise with Matt measuring my heart rate and airflow.
How hard do you think you're working?
Feels like a 16 now.
16 beats heart rate.
177.
175, lovely, good. 2 minutes to go.
Halfway through, and Matt's already seeing the changes.
And stop. Okay, if you just want to go and take a seat. Feel okay, a lightheaded?
I'm a bit lightheaded.
Worse than last time?
Yeah.
I feel close to fainting, and it takes 2 minutes for my head to clear, and I'm not even tight-laced.
Breathing okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, last 10 seconds. Excellent. Well done. You're free.
Yes.
So what happened?
Is that right? Let's get this off you as well.
What can science reveal about the effects of a corset?
So in terms of the rate in which you're breathing,
Look at that.
so even at rest, you can see. So you got the red line is when you're wearing your corset, and the blue line is not when you're not wearing your corset. So you see, even at rest, when you're sitting down, you're breathing in the corset of around about 23, 24 breaths per minute. Whereas when you didn't have the corset on, you were down at about 14 breaths per minute. So it shows that even at rest, the corset is really restricting. And then when it actually comes to when you're doing the exercise, and you can see with your figures, with the corset on, your tidal volume, so the amount of air you get in every breath, is a lot lower. So you're breathing approximately 200 to 300 mils less every single breath with the corset on.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So that's why at the end I felt like I was really fighting to get in air.
Absolutely. Really, with these figures, you can really see the impact the corset, the restriction the corset's having. You're basically hyperventilating in the corset. That's kind of what's happening, because you're breathing an awful lot faster, over 10 breaths per minute. It's an extra 25% faster wearing a corset.
I've proved it's damaging, but could it be a killer?
That chronic underperfusion, not getting enough air down into the bottom of the lungs, could cause problems. It predisposes to infections like pneumonia, and that was something that a very tight corset, worn for many hours a day, could cause problems with. If a woman had an underlying problem, it could exacerbate it. So, for example, if a young girl had rickets from vitamin D deficiency, she'd have soft bones that were still developing, and they could be distorted very much by wearing a tight corset. There are stories of the ribs breaking and piercing the lung underneath, which could be fatal.
As the century wore on, the corset became the focus of a huge debate.
Women's possibilities for activity became much larger over the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, there was nothing unvirtuous in going around on your bicycle, in walking freely. And so this really wasn't very practical for them to be wearing corsets. I mean, this simply didn't work. And increasingly, women began to say, these are pointless, they're just getting in the way. You know, I'm spending hours in the morning getting myself into the corset when I could be doing something far more useful. It really also coincided with the growth of the votes for women, the idea that women were equal citizens. So if they're equal citizens demanding the vote, they shouldn't be treated as some kind of excessive ornament that are there to be looked at and there to be admired and are ruining their health just so they look right for men.
The campaign for change was spearheaded by the Rational Dress Society, established in 1881. Constance Wilde, wife of Oscar, edited the Rational Dress Gazette.
The Rational Dress Society protests against the introduction of any fashion in dress that either deforms the figure, impedes the movement of the body, or in any way tends to injure health.
By the 1890s, some manufacturers had started to respond to demands for looser clothing. Yet one thing will probably never disappear: the temptation to conform to an ideal of beauty, whatever the cost.
Why did women carry on wearing corsets? Well, for exactly the same reason as I was delighted to have a 24-inch waist. It was psychologically rewarding, even if physically it could take its toll.
The idea of that S-shaped figure, we are completely enthralled to it even now. So I don't think that we can really look back on the Victorians and say, oh my goodness, weren't they silly, fainting when they sang, falling all over the place because they wore corsets. I don't think we can say we're that necessarily that far away.
I'm on the trail of the next household danger. I'm heading to the kitchen.
Corsets weren't just worn by middle-class women. They were also worn by their servants as they carried out household tasks. It almost beggars belief. But at least those servants benefited from the proliferation of new gadgets designed to make their lives easier and safer. Well, sort of.
This was a brave new world where the ingenious Victorian inventor felt he had the answers to any domestic problem. But many of these inventions were difficult to use and proved to be dangerous, and people were untrained in how to use them. By the mid-1870s, the Victorians were bringing services into the home, piping in water, and trying out new gas appliances and gadgets.
And of all the new inventions available, what could be more desirable in these dark, damp houses than something that offered heat and light?
Gas was to open a whole new chapter of Victorian household catastrophes.
What we had in the past was everybody would be congregated around a single lamp, and it would be either oil or a candle or something else. And then all of a sudden, people didn't want to live on top of each other all the time. We wanted to find better ways of doing it. And it was towards the end of the Victorian era that they started bringing gas lighting. Lighting that was actually capable of lighting a whole room. It was a massive step forward. It was the greatest innovation. You could have a room that was completely lit.
Yeah, they had coal gas, they had something that was called wood gas, and they had another material called water gas. Now, these were highly poisonous.
There was no control, there was no stopcock, it was just gas.
The worst killer was because you couldn't actually smell it. So you'd have no idea until it was too late, basically. You would just keel over and that would be the end of you.
In the second half of the 19th century, the papers, everything from the Worcester Evening News to the Western Gazette, are full of stories of people dying horribly. These aren't headline cases, they're just little snippets that give the facts and figures. So, for example, in the Manchester Evening News in 1886, there's a story of 5 boys suffocating in a loft. Or there's this one from the Sheffield Independent, 1872. A lady was found confined in a bedroom with her infant and its nurse.
and it says she must have unconsciously deranged the joint of the gas stove, thus permitting an escape of gas. All 3 were found apparently lifeless. But why were such cases so widespread? It may seem obvious to us now, but at the time the dangers of gas were not known to the man in the street. And the gas company's adverts didn't help matters.
Some of the major gas companies coming out with misnomers that gas was actually good for people, that you could actually have a room full of gas and walk in there with a naked light and it would be perfectly safe.
Gas companies were popping up all over the place. You couldn't walk a block in London without seeing a gas company. The rivalry was just huge. But of course, with rivalry comes cost cutting.
What you also had at the time was unscrupulous activities going on between gas suppliers, where they would actually sabotage their opponents or their competitors by actually dropping the pressure.
To save money, companies would reduce their own gas supply to customers at night.
The gas lamp would actually just flicker away and then blow out in the middle of the night. And then the gas would just seep into your home and you wouldn't be waking up in the morning.
It was the heart of the industrial period. They wanted everything new, manufactured, to be seen to be at the cutting edge of what was going on. And that was then how they drove innovation, through making something, engineering something. If it wasn't engineered, it wasn't good.
The speed of change was breathtaking, but there was neither the time nor the will to test these products that would be sold to millions of consumers.
One of the most brilliant contraptions in this age of scientific progress was a system that could provide warmth throughout the whole house, a massive improvement on open coal fires and drafty chimneys.
Gas central heating was a huge thing. In the 1800s, they came up with the idea of a sealed system where you could heat water up exactly the same as a steam train, basically, in a huge cylinder. It was very volatile. The pressure inside these boilers was just absolutely phenomenal. They were running them all around houses. You could have 10, 12, 15, 16 radiators on each system. But of course, you could be sitting down having your lunch and the steam valve doesn't open. You could be tucking into your turtle soup and the next thing is a huge explosion and you'll be leaving the building without opening the door. The pressure was just huge, so it was only ever going to end up in one story, really. It was going to be an accident and people will die.
The main problem was that they didn't understand the dangers of what they were doing. Gas and cast iron hadn't been used in this way in the home before.
When they were actually doing the casting, it was at the very forefront of that technology, of understanding that weaknesses and flaws in that casting could actually cause problems further down the line.
The inventive Victorian engineer, having tackled heat and light, now turned his attention to cooking stoves.
What could be so dangerous about a stove like this?
With an open system, when you had the coal and the massive flue with the smoke pouring up the chimney, ventilation was superb because the air would run through the kitchen, straight up the chimney, take all the smoke away. But when they sort of encompassed it into a sealed container, they had problems with pressure and they had problems with getting rid of the smoke because the actual ventilation and the draft, there wasn't one to go through the system to take the smoke away. So inevitably, the kitchens become really smoky. And of course, this could lead to anything up to suffocation.
If you avoided suffocating in the smoky kitchen, you still had a potential problem.
They made sealed units and poured hot water into them and used them sort of like the modern day kettle. And of course, this was a boiling pot. And of course, it had no release valves or anything like that. And of course, these stoves were just exploding. It was like a small time bomb. It was a totally sealed unit. They didn't understand the pressures and what happened when you introduced oxygen, and you know, these huge, huge catastrophic explosions in kitchens.
Towards the end of the Victorian era, a new power source gradually came into play.
They were starting to turn away from gas because it was so volatile and go towards electricity, basically. But electricity was a killer as well. It wasn't 100% safe when they were, you know, first coming up with these ideas of light bulbs, and because you mix electricity with gas, so you know, you bring your electric lights in. We've still got your gas cooker, and these gas cookers were left on. You know, the joint still corroded, broke down, and let gas escape. And of course, you'd come down in the morning and turn your wonderful new electric light on, and that's the first thing that explodes is your gas cooker. So the two of them, that they weren't to go together. It was a recipe for disaster again.
It wasn't until 1923 that any safety regulations were brought in. But the benefits of a warm, cosy home meant that most were willing to risk the consequences.
Invention was running 100 miles an hour, and we just weren't quick enough to keep up with, or the fitters, or we weren't skilled enough to keep up with it. But the amount of deaths that happen through negligence